everyone, my name is Josh and this one's called Interesting Musings, and today I'm going to be talking about a film, or more specifically a film director, who has really kind of been a very huge influence on not just me as a creative person, but in the entirety of cinema and in the entirety of, any kind of storytelling medium, animation, filmmaking, live action filmmaking, animation filmmaking, any kind of creative art. This director has had a hand in kind of influencing, and this is the director of David Lynch. Now, it's been a while since I've actually done a video on a specific director. The last one I did was when I first started this channel. It was probably my third video, I want to say, that I did, that was based on the entire character of David Cronenberg and what his films basically meant to me. And what I wanted to do with this video was I wanted to basically talk about what makes David Lynch's films so interesting to me. And when I first grew up, I basically found out about this filmmaker through the 100 Greatest Scary Moments on Channel 4, which was hosted by Jimmy Carr, and of course it aired in 2003, October 2003. And it basically counted down all the scariest moments from film and television. And one particular piece of media that was referenced was Blue Velvet. And Blue Velvet has since become one of my favourite films of all time, in the sense that it basically encompasses everything that's great about David Lynch's work, but it manages to do it in a very straightforward kind of way. It manages to have a very straightforward narrative, and it manages to have really interesting characters at the heart of it, and it also has a really good cast. There's Carl McLachlan, there's Isabella Rossellini, there's Dennis Hopper, and there's Laura Dern. So there's so many great actors, and then of course there's the likes of Jack Nance and Brad Dourif. So there's a lot of great actors, great performances, but the story is so well done and it's so well put together. And what I think a lot of people tend to mistake about David Lynch's work is a lot of his films seem to be weird, or weird for the sake of weird, just for the simple case of, oh, let's just throw in some crazy imagery, let's throw in a few weird sequences where characters are talking backwards, that kind of thing. But what's very interesting about his filmmaking is he manages to take one very specific thing about human life that a lot of people don't often tend to talk about, which is your dreams. And he tends to take the very weird elements of dreams and give them a very visual and very visceral kind of feel to it. And when I think of good dream narrative type films, I like to think of films like Lost Highway, which is directed by David Lynch, or Blue Velvet. In many cases, Blue Velvet is essentially the ultimate dream narrative type film, but it's played in sort of real time, because everything in the film, the way it's shot, the way it's edited together, it gives you this impression of being out of reality, of escaping the everyday and kind of going into this much more very surreal and very technicoloured world. That's what it kind of feels like. It kind of has this very Wizard of Oz type feel to it. But what's very interesting about Blue Velvet is it's essentially about one man's awakening of his dark side, the potential. It's about one man's awakening, full stop, essentially, where he goes from being this very innocent, very naive individual who has very simple pleasures and very simple tastes, to kind of going into this dark rabbit hole where he's kind of almost awakening himself to all these very deeper, darker desires and thoughts and feelings. And that's where, at the heart of Blue Velvet, everything seems to click into place. When you view it with that kind of framework, it really is quite interesting, but then it's almost played like a very interesting noir detective mystery story. And that's where I think a lot of David Lynch's films really do shine, is they really do a very good job of going inside the individual mind, going inside their, psychology and their psychosis, and really explores what goes on there. So the beginning of the film basically follows Jeffrey Beaumont as he's come home from college to see his father, who's had an accident, and he basically, tries to stay around and look after him and look after his mum and his grandmother and things like that. But he finds a severed ear in the grass one day, and this unlocks an entire mystery which he has to basically, he wants to solve. And what I really like about David Lynch's work as well is he really plays into the idea of, we all want to play amateur detective, we all want to play amateur sleuth, and that's one of the big themes of Blue Velvet, is it's all about, you know, us unlocking the inner sleuth within us all. Like, there's a moment where in the beginning, in the opening credits, where Bobby Vinton's Blue Velvet is playing, and we're seeing all these different images. One of the images we see is of an elderly woman drinking tea whilst watching a noir film on the television. That's kind of like us kind of indulging. We're indulging these very simple, very light-hearted activities, but we're also indulging our dark side by watching these very dark, very sinister thrillers about people holding guns and having, you know, trench coats and top hats and things like that, you know, going out into the middle of the night on rainy days, standing under lampposts and doing insidious acts of, you know, espionage or trading secrets or, you know, plotting a murder or whatever it happens to be. And that's at the heart of all of us, is we all have a dual side. We always have a duality to ourselves that we occasionally like to indulge in. But for the most part, we keep it shelved when we're in our everyday lives. That's the thesis of David Lynch, is he plays around a lot of duality and the dual self. In Blue Velvet, he talks about the characters of Frank Booth and Jeffrey Beaumont, Jeffrey Beaumont is played by Carl McLaughlin, and Frank Booth is played by Dennis Hopper. Jeffrey Beaumont is the innocent, everyday Archie Andrews kind of American teen, whereas Frank Booth is very sinister. He's very, you know, seedy and very kind of, you know, insidious in his intent. He's absolutely bloody insane, and he goes from being this very kind of, you know, laid back, very kind of, you know, almost like, oh, I don't care what anyone thinks kind of thing. But then he would jump into this very aggressive, very angry, swear-fueled monster. And that's one of the things that I really like to explore, is basically Frank Booth is the dark side of what Jeffrey Beaumont could potentially be if it was fully allowed to manifest. Because there's a moment halfway through the film where, when he's confronted with Frank Booth, he's sniffing on his oxygen mask, his amyl nitrate oxygen mask, and he says to Jeffrey, "You're like me, kid." And it's like, he knows what Jeffrey is capable of, even without fully seeing firsthand what he is capable of. And that's what I really think is really interesting. And of course, Jeffrey just has this kind of very kind of angry, very frustrated look on his face. Like, he wants to hurt Frank Booth so badly because he's such an evil person. But at the same time, he knows that he can't do it. Like, he has no real courage yet. That part of himself hasn't been unlocked. But that's kind of a very interesting thing, is all of this is kind of almost like a dream narrative to Jeffrey, where he's kind of seeing himself as the hero of this story. But in trying to do that, he unlocks a part of himself that he doesn't feel comfortable with, this darker side that he hasn't been able to fully acquaint himself with because he's been so sheltered for most of his life. So when he gets the opportunity to finally confront this evil, he does so in the form of a noir hero, or a very Hitchcockian hero, who kind of finds themselves stumbling into this darkness outside of this very regular everyday American suburbia. And that's one of the aspects of David Lynch's films that really are very well explored here. But also, what David Lynch explores very well and very thoroughly in a lot of his films is the idea of dreams, and using dreams as a way of figuring stuff out, and the way of, you know, dealing with everyday issues and everyday problems, everyday conflicts. So the good majority of films, like, say, for example, Mulholland Drive, are all about one woman trying to come to terms with her betrayal of her girlfriend, who essentially cheated on her with a film producer in order to get a role, even though she, and this woman is played by Naomi Watts, worked very hard to get that role. She did whatever she could. She trained real hard. She made sure that she got waitressing jobs just to pay the bills. She really worked hard to get the job that she got. But then, of course, her girlfriend gets the part because she sleeps with the producer. And that's one of the things that really is quite dark about the entire narrative in Mulholland Drive, is it basically explores the fact that you really don't have any agency when you are trying to get a role in Hollywood. There's always deeper, darker, you know, works at play trying to make sure that you get those roles and you get them successfully. So instead of actually trying to confront the producer about this, Diane, played by Naomi Watts, tries to assassinate her girlfriend for stealing the part that she feels was rightfully hers. But while all this is going on, we also have a dream narrative where we are introduced to Betty, who is the pure personification of innocence, getting almost, caught up in this very noir-esque story about a girl who has amnesia, trying to basically figure out who she is. But in the meantime, there's all these other grey and very, dark and sinister scenes. And there's all sorts of different pieces that do eventually come together and join together to form the worst nightmare of all to Diane, played by Naomi Watts, which is the reality of her situation, that she's actually, involved herself in this very dark business of trying to kill her lover just so she can get back at her for basically stealing this part from her. And it's a really, really, really powerful movie. I'm not really giving it any justice, but I think you really do need to see Mulholland Drive and films like Blue Velvet because they really are good films. I would definitely recommend starting off with Blue Velvet because Blue Velvet has a very straightforward narrative. Yes, it does often play around with the very same ideas and themes as, things like Twin Peaks or Lost Highway or Inland Empire, if we really want to go really far into the dark realms of David Lynch's work, or Eraserhead. But what's very interesting is that Blue Velvet really does create a very interesting middle ground for a lot of David Lynch's work. It's very much, dreamlike and very heavily influenced on, duality and all these other things and all these other concepts that are really outlandish. But he manages to explore all these themes in a very straightforward, almost very linear narrative, whereas a lot of his other works tend to really go abstract, and they tend to, a lot of the times, they don't really have any real linkage, and they do get lost to... Actually, saying it gets lost in the abstract is a little bit of a disservice because there is a central narrative. A lot of people can make that argument with films like Eraserhead, where it might seem like it gets lost in the abstract and it gets too strange too quickly, but there is a narrative. With Eraserhead, it's all about a man who isn't ready for parenthood, adjusting to fatherhood, essentially. This fatherhood that he didn't plan on having, this baby that he didn't plan on having, coming into his life and him not being able to cope with it. That's what the central idea of Eraserhead is. And the whole entire idea of it being the idea of Eraserhead, the title, is that, the mind can be a writing tool. It can write and erase anything it wants, and it can literally erase anything it wants when they're in the safety and sanctity of the dream world. And the dream world is what the main character is in throughout the course of that story. And I think, when I really think about it, David Lynch is an absolute genius. The fact that he can basically take these very abstract ideas, which is the concept of dreaming, duality, spirituality, all these different things, and try to blend them together in these very American-style traditions of the noir, of the secret suburbia, of all these different abstract areas of Americana, the very 1950s Americana, that a lot of us, see through films like Grease and what have you, tend to, manifest themselves in much more darker ways when you look at David Lynch's work. Like, say, for example, in the film Wilder Heart, it's essentially a critique of Technicolor films like Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz, more specifically. But then you throw in a caricature character like Sailor, played by Nicolas Cage. He's basically a stand-in for Elvis Presley. He has a very, very Elvis Presley type voice. He wears a lot of, Elvis Presley's type of clothes. But in many ways, he kind of is also a personification of that dream that I think all women have, which is to kind of fall in love with this guy who's very much dangerous and damaged, but he's not the type of person who could harm you or hurt you. He's one of those people who is basically only acting out of frustration. In fact, even though he has the caricatures of an Elvis Presley type, he has a lot more in common with someone like James Dean, the type of person who is very broken and very damaged inside, but in many ways he just wants to be loved and understood, and that's something that he kind of, plays with throughout the course of that film as well. So there's so many different ways of looking at David Lynch's work, and I think he's one of the best filmmakers who basically talks about all these different subjects and ideas. And I think his films do deserve a lot of attention, especially when it comes to the public. viewing of his films, because I think a lot of people, a lot of critics love his films, but I think if you actually sat down and watched a film of his, he's not one of those filmmakers where you watch it once and you immediately get everything. I think it takes multiple viewings, and you can each come away with something from his films. It doesn't always have to be the same. There's always something in his films that really does make it for you. And like all art, it just depends on the individual's interpretation. And what I really like about his films is you don't go to his films for just one thing. If you want to be moved, if you want to be terrified, if you want to make yourself laugh or really kind of have a really good old time, David Lynch's films are kind of like the art house equivalent of Marvel films, where they have everything for everyone. There's no strict genre, there's no strict tone with a lot of his films, but they are for everyone. They are for everyone in some way, and I think that's something that I really do think is quite a shame that not a lot of his films do get a lot of attention. They are dark, they are very sinister, but there are funny moments as well, but they're not straight up comedies, if that makes sense. So there's all these different things. So that's basically my overview of the works of David Lynch. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to do more films like this in the future. I know the last time I did a video like this, it was with a different director, but I'd like to do more films like this where I tackle certain directors that I like and basically go in depth about their filmography and how they basically got their start as storytellers. I hope you enjoyed this video, and this has been Josh with Whimsical and Interesting Musings, and let me know in the comments if you actually enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more videos of this type on this channel. That's all for now. Take care, bye-bye for now.